Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and welcome to the continuing celebration of the Pagoda by Rose Norman, which is Sinister Wisdom 131. Here's the beautiful embodied book, and you'll see the image behind Rose Norman a little bit later in our program. My name is Julie Enzer, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's event. We have an hour of conversation planned that explores oral histories as a vital part of this fabulous new issue of Sinister Wisdom and as crucial to lesbian history. Thank you so much for joining us. And now I encourage you to sit back and relax for a wonderful evening of lesbian conversations. Before we begin, it has become our custom to spend a moment for a land acknowledgement. This moment continues to be particularly potent as we have continuing war in the Middle East. I am mindful of the many layers of the conflict in Israel and Palestine. Many of us are mourning the loss of life in Gaza as we continue to witness genocide, and we still pray for the safe return of the hostages being held. Occupation and war weigh on our minds, as does the continuing climate catastrophe, this week impacting our fellow humans in California. As we pause for land acknowledgement, I want to ask us to raise up our voices for peace and ecological preservation. In the United States and around the world, many of us are on occupied, unceded land. I am in what is now Dover, Florida, traditional homelands and territories of the Seminole. Please insert into the chat your location and acknowledge the land on which you live as we pause to recognize the histories of war and colonization, and, as importantly, to imagine and work for a world where we have a fair and equitable distribution of resources, and a world where we find ways to honor one another and live in peace. Many of you, as I look at the gathering of folks here this evening, already know a lot about Sinister Wisdom, but I'm going to just remind you that we're a quarterly journal of lesbian literature and art. We're entirely supported by subscriptions and donations to our nonprofit organization. Sinister Wisdom started in 1976, and we have been publishing continuously since then. That's right, we're getting ready to celebrate 50 years in 2026. If you are not currently a subscriber, I encourage you to sign up for a subscription today by going to sinisterwisdom.org/subscribe. In addition, a group of monthly sustainers are vital to Sinister Wisdom. If you can give monthly, please do. You can sign up as a sustainer at sinisterwisdom.org/sustainers. Sinister Wisdom, operated ably by our board member, Roberta Arnold, sends out emails every month when your gift comes in with behind-the-scenes details and new information about what we have coming up in the journal. Being a sustainer is a great way to support us. A few housekeeping notes. You'll notice you're all muted as you come in, one of our technology innovations. If you unmute accidentally and we detect noise from you, we will mute you as the program goes forward. If you want to show appreciation for readers, feel free to raise your hand for readers and speakers at things that you agree with. You are also welcome to use reaction emojis on Zoom. Please feel free to test that out. Also, as you know, light up the chat. Sometimes some of the best things at our events are happening in the chat. As always, the lovely and delightful Max is with us this evening to help with technical assistance. We are recording the event, and it will be available at some point tomorrow or Thursday at sinisterwisdom.org/pagoda. That will be the full recording and the chat transcript. So without further delay, we will begin. Oral histories, or herstories in the language of some of our panelists, are a way to capture stories and first-person reports of lesbian life, lesbian organizations, and lesbian activism. They are created in a variety of ways, which you will hear about this evening. And they offer not only a way to preserve lesbian and queer women's history, but also a way to create intergenerational understandings of our shared lesbian past. Oral histories are a method that can help us to unlock the stories of what has happened in the past and inspire and challenge us about what kinds of work we might do in the future. Sinister Wisdom, as many of you know, has done a number of issues of the journal that build on oral histories of lesbians, including our current issue, The Pagoda. This evening, we're going to talk about oral histories as a method for telling lesbian stories and think about some places where we need more oral history work to preserve the lesbian past. So tonight, we have a round table with 4 panelists. And how we're going to proceed is I'm going to introduce each of them briefly. They will then each speak for 3 to 5 minutes about their really fascinating oral history projects that they're working on. And then we're going to move into a roundtable discussion with the 5 of us. So I will introduce them in the order in which they'll speak at the beginning, and then we'll move into our roundtable process. So Rose Norman is a retired professor who taught English at the University of Alabama in Huntsville for 27 years. Her work as general editor of the Southern Lesbian Feminist Activist Herstory Project led her to over 10 years of research on the Pagoda Residential Community and Cultural Center. During that time, she's interviewed over 100 lesbian feminist activists and co-edited 6 special issues of Sinister Wisdom. Our second panelist is Dr. Alex Ketchum. Alex is an assistant professor at McGill University's Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. Coinciding with the 50th anniversary of the trailblazing restaurant Mother Courage of New York City, Ketchum's second book, Ingredients for Revolution, A History of American Feminist Restaurants, Cafes, and Coffee Houses, is the first history of the more than 230 feminist and lesbian feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses that existed in the United States from 1972 to the present. As key sites of cultural and political significance, this volume shows the essential roles of these institutions served for multiple social justice movements, including women's liberation, LGBTQ equality, and food justice, as well as for training women workers and entrepreneurs. Our third panelist is Shanta Smith-Cruz. Shanta is a volunteer coordinator at the Lesbian Herstory Archive and the Associate Dean for Teaching, Learning, and Engagement at New York University's Division of Libraries. Sean is a recipient of the 2020 WGSS Award for Significant Achievement in Women's and Gender Studies in Librarianship, sponsored by Duke University Press. Administered by the College of, that award is administered by the Association of College and Research Libraries, and it's for her work that she'll talk about tonight, archiving Salsa Soul Sisters. And last, but certainly not least, I'm delighted to welcome Kathleen Rhodes as our 4th panelist. Kathleen is a master lecturer in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at Old Dominion University, where she has trained students in queer oral history collection, created the region's first student-led queer walking tour series, and helped develop ODU's new Queer Studies minor. In 2015, Rhodes founded the Tidewater Queer History Project, a community-based organization dedicated to collecting, preserving, and documenting LGBTQ history in southeastern Virginia. Under her leadership, TQHP, that's the Tidewater Queer History Project, has built Tidewater's largest digital repository of local queer history and a physical archive of historical objects. Having grown up in rural Virginia, she's particularly interested in queer stories and experiences in the rural South. So first, I invite Rose Norman to share some reflections and tell us about the oral histories that you did that formed the basis of the Pagoda.
Thanks, Julie. Well, the idea for my book, The Pagoda, A Lesbian Community by the Sea, just out from Sinister Wisdom, came from a project that began at Woman Rights, the Southeast Lesbian Writers Conference in 2009. Women at Woman Rights had been talking about the fact that the histories and memoirs of the 20th century women's movement were ignoring the South. To read these histories, you would think that all the feminist activism was going on in New York or the West Coast or, maybe Chicago. And we knew better and decided to do something about it. We had collected about 50 interviews with lesbian feminist activists working in Southern states when we arranged to archive our interviews at the Sally Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture at Duke University. And we've now archived over 100 of those interviews there, and we have almost that many more that are in the process of being made ready for archiving. About the same time that we made that connection with Duke, we made a connection with Julie Enzer and began pulling together stories from the interviews as special issues of Sinister Wisdom. Over the years, we published a total of 6 of those special issues on various themes. And now we have a website where we're continuing to collect and publish these interviews and stories from them. That's slfahistoryproject.org. And I think Max will put that in the chat. It was the special issue on land dykes of the South that first got me interested in writing about the Pagoda, a women's cultural center, guest house, and residential community in St. Augustine, Florida, active 1977 to 99. I soon had far more pagoda interviews and stories than could be told in our special issues, although we did publish pagoda stories in 3 of our special issues. I was astonished to find that so little had been published about the pagoda, which was a long-lasting, that's 22 years it was active, a long-lasting feminist project that was unique among women's land communities and a microcosm of the feminist activism that was going on all over the country in those last decades of the 20th century. I did find a 1982 interview with 2 pagoda residents in Lesbian Land. That's Joyce Cheney's collection of 28 interviews with women living in lesbian land communities all over the country. The only academic writing I found about it was part of an essay by Nancy Unger in a collection about lesbian alternative environments called Queer Ecologies, which she then revised somewhat for her book, Beyond Nature's Housekeepers, American Women in Environmental History. That was 2012. Unger's focus on the environment means that she leaves out a lot of the pagoda story and maybe relying on just that interview in Lesbian Land. One of the pagoda residents also published an essay about the pagoda in the journal Lesbian Ethics. She published that in 1984, a year before she moved away. I soon learned that her version of events differed from some other residents' versions. I knew that the stories I had collected had to be a book to tell the whole story, or really my understanding of it. With every person I interviewed, the picture changed a little, and there are more living pagoda women who could be interviewed and others who I could not find. There's also a substantial collection of pagoda newsletters, financial reports, deeds, guest books, and other documents now archived at the University of Florida. And I'm hoping some enterprising graduate student will come along and continue the story.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Rose. Alex, talk to us about the restaurants.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here. I'm joining you from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. And tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the oral histories in my book, Ingredients for Revolution, which I'm very grateful that Sinister Wisdom ran a wonderful review of. So thank you, Sinister Wisdom. And I'm going to also talk about how my process of doing interviews and oral histories for that project also led to kind of developing some of my own methods for later oral history projects. In Ingredients for Revolution, I was looking at the history of feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses in the US. And then it was also based on doctoral work where I also looked at these spaces in Canada. And many of these spaces, almost all of them, were run by lesbians and queer women. But many of these spaces didn't have that much information within archives. Sometimes there would be a box of some material, sometimes it would just be ephemera, business cards, and so forth. So oral history has really allowed me to flesh out a lot of these stories, find more information and details. It was in part from the process of doing these oral histories, both with people who started the feminist restaurants as well as people who visited them, that I was able to start to pick up some skills in terms of learning to bring materials to the interview that could sometimes spark memories, which I think helped make people remember details that they might have forgotten, and also thinking about using interviews as a place to have participants compare what I was finding in the archives to their own memories. Because sometimes the materials I would find in archives might be news clippings or one person's account, kind of what Rose was talking about, how there are these differing accounts, right? Everyone has their own memories, their own opinions, their own ideas and perspectives. And that's one of the things that I find really beautiful about doing oral history. I was also able in this project to benefit from other oral history projects. So Lisa Vicoli was running a project on lesbian and queer women's histories in Minnesota, that when I was revising my book, Lisa shared some of these early interviews with me, where folks were talking about their own experiences within the Minnesota context. So I also like this story because it reminds us of how much of a community there can be around oral history. And one of the things that has been so wonderful with the digitization of archives and transcripts is that we're able to sometimes access oral histories that people have conducted in the past and so forth. And so through my experiences with Ingredients for Revolution, it's guided my newest research project on queer internet histories, in which I'm speaking to a variety of lesbian and queer organizations about how their organizations helped other organizations move online in the early 1990s. But through that, I've started to develop some oral history processes in which I, for example, when I've been speaking to some of the founders and people who were really involved in organizing Dyke TV, which was a TV organization centered out of New York City, I was able to bring up archived versions of web pages with the Internet Wayback Machine that also helped spark some memory. So that's been a pretty cool project. I've also really enjoyed taking what I've been learning about oral history over the past 12 or so years that I've been doing this work to also bring that to my students. So I've been fortunate to get a few grants and work in partnership in Montreal with two different organizations, the Archives Gays du Québec, so the Gay Archives of Quebec, which is an LGBTQ archival organization, and the Archives Lesbian du Québec, which is a lesbian archival organization and kind of sapphic archives. And so I've been working in partnership with those two archives and a team of around 7 students. Last year, we conducted 17 oral histories and provided transcripts, and they're housed at both archives. And this year, we got a new grant to do another 10. So it's been really exciting to do this work and kind of fill out some of the gaps, and to do this in partnership with an archive and find out like places that they're also hoping to expand, as well as training a new generation of lesbian and queer oral historians. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. And Sean, I have a feeling you'll tell us a little bit about your local archive as well in conjunction with your project on Salsa Soul Sisters.
You know it, Julie, absolutely. And in fact, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to time myself so that I don't take up too much time, but I want to show you. Okay, there we go. Stopwatch is on. And your screen is now being taken over, so warning. So I'm just sharing first to say that the project is at the Lesbian Herster Archives, or it's taken place and it holds at the Lesbian Herster Archives. But the Lesbian Herster Archives also has other oral history projects, or many, let's just say 50 years worth. This is our 50th anniversary. Some that have just recently happened because of a Mellon-funded grant is the Lesbian Elders Oral History Project. So you may have heard of this. That is one that was specifically connected to the grant, and there was a call for lesbian elders, and that one was sort of in existence. There's also the work that we do with the Pratt School of Information, where There are lesbian histories, most of which are video or audio. So these sort of weren't oral history projects as much as they are oral history recordings that existed inside of the archives that were contained as a group, and they're available at this site. So I recommend for folks to check out those two sites. I can put them in the chat. Another thing that came through the funding from the Mellon Foundation was the creation of another Omeka site that we mirrored off of the Pratt School of Information site. And it has multiple exhibition collections, and they're meant to be sort of showcases of materials that had been exhibited. And so an example of that includes the Salsa Soul Sisters. And so there's these various collections by format or exhibition, and they have connected to them essays that can contextualize the items. So almost as if you're walking through the exhibit and you're getting a hand holding or someone in your ear telling you about the project. And so the Salsa Soul Sisters has essays that were curated to help you to understand the objects that are connected. One of those essays was written by Alexis Pauline Gums, and they're really beautiful. The other is in memory of Salsa Soul, and this one was written by the person who did the oral history project, Crew Megdu, who's the founder of Black Lesbian Archive. So I wanted to give you all of that context to then show you more about the Salsa Soul. And I use this deck specifically for a reunion. Salsa Soul Sisters is a Black and Latina lesbian organization or same-gender woman organization that started 50 years ago in New York City. And in 2010, I did a kind of Black lesbian, what was it, in 1970s. It was like a zine revealing hundreds of people came to the archives, maybe 110 to be exact. And from that, I met a lot of the women from the Salsa Soul Sisters. And 6 years later, which is what this overview is, I asked for them to give their material to the collections. And really, it was focused on photographs, posters, and correspondence. I didn't really want, at the time, a thought about oral histories. And so people started to give materials. We had a lot already that were donated from a member of the Salsa Soul Sisters, Georgia Brooks, in the 80s. And so this was really the request to add to that collection and do more. From those additions, we had exhibitions. So we had an exhibit at the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Gallery in New York City in 2018. And then we also had one at the Brooklyn College Library in 2019. And then we had, these are sort of pieces from the exhibit. What I wanted to highlight here are the names of the ancestors, so the women who had already passed, and then those who had been identified as folks within the collection that are part of the Salsa Soul Sisters. And this list continued to grow. And what was great about getting that list of names and where they were and what they did, and having everyone together to participate in these community-focused exhibitions, was that we realized we needed more. There was never enough. So even at these events where people gathered, we recorded stories. The end point really is that once we, and then we were also at the New York Historical Society. Once we had the material and we wanted to put it in a digital environment, what we realized is that when we had all of these objects, and specifically when we had the exhibit of photographs, we needed names of people. We needed to know when it happened, who was there. And that is what drove the Oral History Project. We asked people if they could get on a Zoom call and look at a photo. And when looking at that photo, talk about what that day was like, what was the music, who was dancing, who's in that blue outfit, right? Like really reliving it. And so we recorded those moments of conversation. They were really rich. And that was sort of now it's sort of a separate thing that we have these collections of conversation connected to the ephemera. And thanks.
Thank you so much, Sean. As you know, I just love that work that you did with Salsa Soul Sisters. Kathleen, talk to us about the Tidewater.
All right, so I'm sharing my screen as well. I love visuals, so I have some photos and video to go with it. And I thought I would just talk about, kind of tell the story of how the Tidewater Queer History Project got started. It was really inspired by two lesbians, one I never met and one I've known for a couple of decades now. So the first was Shirley Pritchard. She was the woman that I never met. Shirley passed away in 2013, but she had owned a very well-known locally bar called Shirley's. And it was just like always kind of there. I was hearing about it from particularly lesbians in the area, but gay people in general. And I had always kind of had this fantasy that like one day I'll get to meet Shirley and I'll get to ask her questions or hear her stories. And I was really disappointed that never happened. If I just show you a few more things, this is an ad from when Shirley's first opened in 1978. I don't know whether she would have thought of it as a feminist place, but it certainly seems very feminist to me when I look at the advertisements for it. It was one of 3 bars. So Shirley's in 1978, she opened, of course, but then she also managed Stella Street and Ms. P's. And actually, if I could throw a rock over my shoulder, I could almost hit the building that those are in. When we moved to this neighborhood, my partner and I had no idea that it had that much lesbian history, but there were 3 lesbian bars in this little teeny strip mall in the front of our neighborhood. But Shirley's was part of, as you can see from this slide, a really vibrant network of women's bars just in the city of Norfolk. So that's where I am, Norfolk, Virginia. And if you've heard of Norfolk for anything, it's probably been for the Navy, because we have the world's biggest Navy base here. But we also had a lot of lesbian bars in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. So, I kept thinking about Shirley, and the other woman who inspired this work was my friend Marge. And I met Marge over 20 years ago through my partner, Robin. These are 2 of my favorite pictures of Marge. The one on the left was in the 2000s at some time, and I think probably the one on the right was maybe in the 80s. But Marge retired to Arizona several years ago, but she would come back on these trips to see us. And Robin and I had just bought our first house. And Marge was sitting in the living room with me. And I was like, oh, because Shirley had recently passed away. And I was like, I can't believe we've like lost all those stories, that all the things that she could have told us. And somebody needs to record these stories, and so that we have them and so that I can listen to them. And Marge looked at me, as she often did, and just really bluntly said, you need to do this. You should do this work. And I thought it, and I probably said it to her too, I have no idea how to get started and how to do this. But Marge has always been very persuasive. And so her voice was in my head. All those ideas about Shirley were in my head. And so that's really how this got started, was from these like very kind of humble beginnings of not really knowing what I was doing, but being really interested and passionate about it. I'm going to let a few photos from Marge play through. Marge actually a few years ago donated her entire photography collection to me and to the Tidewater Queer History Project. And she really documented so much of queer history in general in our area, but specifically lesbian history, which has been not well documented at all in our area. So I'm really grateful to have all of these photos of Marge's, in addition to all her memories. She was actually the first interview that I ever did for TQHP. And then what I've done since then, very similar to Alex, I have started to work a lot with students. So I also teach at Old Dominion University. I teach in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. And I thought I would just talk for a minute about what we've done with some of this work. So of course, it started with the oral histories. Initially, I was collecting all of those, and then I started to train students in some of that oral history collection. And you can see a student here. This was after an interview that she did where they're sharing photographs. And then we took a lot of that information from the oral history interviews and additional research, and my students and I created a series of walking tours. So these were in-person walking tours before COVID, that we did every year. And then we shifted to an online format. And then since then, we have started to think about other things, like students have created short films. We've done a virtual reality project. And then also I've worked with students to sort of translate some of these stories into something that's appropriate for K through 12 audiences. So you see a student here, she made this really cool storybook about local LGBTQ history. It's like all this felt in her book. And then finally, I've also created comic books with students. And this year, actually this semester, I got a small grant from the university, and our comic books will be all about local LGBTQ history. So I wanted to talk about that, both how we got started, but also like all the things that are available to you to do with the materials that you collect when you do this kind of work. Yeah, so that's it. I was going to end with this picture. This is another of Marge's photographs, but thanks so much.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Rose, Alex, and Sean. That's all so fantastic. I'm so inspired. So we're going to have a roundtable. Folks who are on the Zoom with us are invited to put questions into the chat, and I will raise them up for our panelists. I, of course, have a couple up to get us started. And I want to start with asking you, what do you wish you had known when you started out that you learned through mistakes and experience? Sort of invite you to give a little, some tips to our listeners who we hope are thinking about doing projects like this themselves.
I mean, I guess I can begin on this question. So I think there's two big things. The first is a little bit about confidence in reaching out to people. I had really, I really admire a lot of the people that I'm interviewing. And early on when I was doing this, I was so shy and I was like, will they even want to speak to me? And I would say, if you're interested in doing one of these projects, send that email, make that connection, make that phone call. Worst that happens is they say no. But it really took me a little while to get started and start to reach out to people. And then another thing is a bit more on the technical side. Part of this is that some of these technologies have changed, but there's still limitations in what languages you're doing some of the work in. So now what I do is I oftentimes ask folks, if even if it's an in-person interview, if they're okay with it, to have a Zoom recording so that there's an auto transcription, because Otter AI is pretty good, but if you're working in English, or you can run through a transcription software afterwards, which wasn't available to me in the same way when I first started doing these, but there's still certain limitations. So for the Montreal Oral History Project, more than half of our interviews are in French. And so right now, a lot of the auto transcription doesn't work as well in French. So if folks are wanting to provide transcriptions to the oral histories, which I do find help users navigate, they can word search them. It has led to a greater number of people using these oral histories at the HEQ that I mentioned, the Archives du Québec. But it means that's a lot more time in terms of transcription. So in terms of like balancing time, giving a lot more time towards transcription is key.
I learned from one of the people I interviewed about something called freeconferencecalling.com, which allows you to do a phone interview. Many of our interviews are done by phone, and record it. And it's a pretty decent recording, because before that I was doing phone interviews with a recording, with a digital recorder sitting next to the phone, which were good enough. But I really started using freeconferencecalling.com a lot.
I can, I was gonna not talk about, well, actually, yes, the slowness of the work, I think, is something that I wish I had really truly grasped 14 years ago when I started a project and thought in my like youthful mind, oh, everything takes a season to do. No, like archival work and oral history work takes a lifetime, actually. And you sort of adopt it and you just keep it and it grows. Even if you are thinking about the technical prospects of it, you have to replay things in real time, you know, like you have to listen to it. And if you want to do something with it, you have to analyze it, and then you have to hear the whole thing. It can't be split up. I think that in sort of our Instagrammable culture where you want things to be sound bit in like 30 seconds. I used to be archivist at StoryCorps, which is like this national oral history project. I was their archive coordinator there for 2 years. And I didn't even know StoryCorps was an NPR program that had these like 1-minute sound bites. I thought it was just an oral history project for the Library of Congress. And so learning about the idea that someone would take a full 2-hour interview and turn it into a minute, I mean, it just boggles my mind. It's almost impossible to me. And so thinking about someone's whole life encapsulated into a story, if you ask them a second time, like if you go back to someone and have them tell their story again, it's a totally different object. Like it's a completely different story. And so the slowness and sort of the honoring of someone's story and their storytelling and the process of that, it's a dance. It's very slow. And I think I had underestimated the time it takes to tell a story.
Yeah, those are all such good answers. I think the only thing I could add is something's better than nothing, right? Like that's what I would tell myself in my like original country accent, as I just did. And what I mean is that I got so overwhelmed, and I still do, by the amount of work there is to do, by the technical part of it. You know, it was really important to me to video the oral histories that we did because I wanted to see these queer people's faces, because I didn't see enough of those everywhere I looked. And it introduced an extra level of complexity to it. I was really worried about the sound, you know, because you read all this stuff and it's like the sound is really important. And then I was like, and I'm trying to do the video, and I look back and a lot of it from the beginning, the middle, the most recent is imperfect in a lot of ways, but having that material is really important. And even if the sound isn't great, or we did some of them over Zoom during COVID, and you know how Zoom is, you kind of go in and out, you miss a few things here and there, but just doing the work, I think, even if it's not in its most perfect form, is what's more important.
Is it okay if I add something to that? Because Kathleen sparked an idea, which is about the imperfection. So it's on oral history, but when I was doing archival research, there would sometimes be these cassette tapes that would be, there's some in Northeastern, some at the Cheddar, and it would be that during different lesbian meetings, feminist meetings, someone would just start a tape recorder and just record the meeting. And for some reason, this one cassette tape would end up in an archive, and I would listen to it and I could hear everyone's voices talking, sharing their ideas, arguing. The sound quality, not great, right? Tape recorder from the 1970s. The tape is old, but it still gave me so much. And I think one, embrace the imperfection. We all have different like material barriers. And yes, there's difficulties with preservation, which we might touch on later, and why sometimes the audio can be easier to preserve than the video. But also, we have no idea how these oral histories will be used, right? I don't think the people recording that meeting thought 50 years later, 40 years later, that some grad student would listen and write down everything and just have their mind blown, you know? So I think if when in doubt, do one of these projects if you're excited about it.
That's great. There's great stuff happening in the chat. Lots of people sharing resources, and a couple questions that I want to lift up. And the first one is, could you each talk about what made you personally interested in studying and preserving the history of earlier generations?
I can start with that. My dissertation was on women's autobiography. That was what got me interested in women's stories a long time ago. So I loved interviewing women and hearing the stories of what they did and why.
You know, we don't get to hear the stories. And so when I came out in my 20s, I didn't know any lesbians older than me. I knew the ones that I met in college, and that was really exciting. They were, well, no, I take that back. I had two professors. And I was just so interested in them. I wanted to know everything about them. But I think for me, it was that I wanted to know what it had been like to be a lesbian outside of my own self, and outside of maybe like the day that I was living in, like what had it been like 20 years before and 40 years before. I wanted to know what that history was because it was a direct line to me, in a way that we just don't hear anywhere else.
I love that you say that, Kathleen, because mine was somewhat opposite, but it landed in the same place, which is I wanted to learn what my future would look like. So I was more selfish. What's going to happen to me in the future? What does it look like? Especially if I'm not going to do all the traditional things that my mother, for example, would do. And so I found older lesbians to think they could show me their current life, but older lesbians wanted to tell me about their past, right? And, of course, that is because I landed in older lesbians at the Lesbian History Archive, so they're archivists, and that's what they do. But just, the Sankofa, the like looking to your past in order to understand your future was what I grasped from that aim to learn about what I could do going forward. And then I became obsessed. Ultimately, you can't dip your toe or your tongue or whatever into the past and not want to indulge while you're there. Okay, I had to do it, Julie. I'm sorry.
I love it. I am all here for the cunnilingus references.
I think, oh,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think I also shared the kind of like looking for the future or like looking for my present. There was this restaurant, it never actually opened, but it was called Clementine's. It was a project in Toronto, and they had the tagline, "The place you always wanted to go but never could find." And it took me years of working on this project, the restaurant project, to realize that I was actually looking for like myself and what I was looking like the kinds of places I want to find. I even had an article with that title and I didn't get that it was actually the past talking to me. So I think it was again trying to figure out what the future could look like, trying to figure out like what kind of spaces I wanted to be in and what I was trying to understand more about myself and my community.
Great. Thank you all. We had this great question that is, what is the relationship between the individual and the communal? And the questioner says, what I'm trying to ask is, are there specific ways to encourage lesbians who aren't part of a community in a traditional sense to participate in archiving projects? And, you all have different frames for how you've done your oral history projects. But what about lesbians who like might be kind of unaffiliated, and how might they participate in this work?
I'll start us on this question because, Julie, one of the things you had asked us to think about was something that surprised us when we did this work. When I set out to do this, I wanted to know about lesbians. It's called the Tidewater Queer History Project because it was so hard to get lesbian stories. And what I found was that a lot of women didn't think that their stories counted. So they might say things to me like, oh, well, I was married and I was married to a man and I had kids. And I've only been out, for X number of years. And I'm like, well, that's a lesbian story. Like, that's a pretty common lesbian story, actually. Or they didn't think that the ordinariness of their lives was important. And that's actually something I've been so interested in capturing. So I do a lot of oral history interviews with like local activists and stuff, but also one of the things that I love so much about my friend Marge's photographs is that a lot of them are just lesbians in the backyard playing with their dogs. And, there are lots of dogs and cats in those photos, and I love it. But those ordinary lives, I mean, that's the kind of life that I live. I think that's what most of us do. Like, you get up, you go to work, you eat breakfast, you do all the things, and you do them as a lesbian, or you do them as, whatever, however you live your life. But they don't think that those stories are important enough to be archived in a way that I have not encountered with gay men. So they very much value their stories and are very eager to tell those stories. But I think it is a challenge. And one of the things that I've had to figure out how to do, and I'm still not all that good at it, is how do I convince them that these are exactly the stories that I want to hear and that other people want to hear. Yeah, so it's a challenge. I don't have a good solution for it.
I agree. That's all I have.
This
But
is
even
a quality.
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
A quality of women's autobiography is that often women don't feel that their stories need to be told or important enough to be told. And so they often apologize for writing it all. And I wondered sometimes when somebody asked me recently while we were studying the stories in the South, of course, I already said that was because the stories hadn't been told. And then they wanted to know, well, why weren't they telling their stories? And I don't know. Maybe they thought it was more important to do the activism than to brag about having done the activism.
Yeah, to quickly echo that, I oftentimes find when I reach out to folks, they're like, are you sure you want to interview me? Maybe you want to interview someone else. Like, I'm not that important. And sometimes it'll be someone who started an organization and did so many things. I'm like, what do you mean you're not important? But also, all lives and all stories are really important to our work, right? As Kathleen was saying. But there's definitely, as Kathleen was pointing at, and Rose was pointing at, and Sean has also kind of spoken to, right? There's definitely gendered aspects to this, right? Of not feeling like your stories are worthy, but these are worthy stories.
So our next question is, I'm gonna make it a two-part question for you all. One is, how somebody asked, how do you find a place to archive the oral histories that you're doing? How did you choose your repository? And then other people are interested in, how do we find a place to archive our own work, or if we have objects or things that papers that we want to donate? Do you have recommendations for that?
Well, I can tell how we got the connection with Duke is that two of us on the project are academics, and so we're accustomed to going to libraries and working in archives. And we went to Duke because we knew they had the woman rights archives for one thing, and therefore we got to know some librarians and talked to them about would they be interested in archiving this. So I think the step one, find a librarian, talk to a librarian. Librarians are great networkers, and that if they don't want your stuff, they'll tell you who to go to.
I have something I'm going to recommend and pop into the chat, but there's also the LGBTQ Digital Collaboratory, and they have an oral history hub, which links to a bunch of different oral history projects. So for folks who have stories that they do want to share, that can be a great way to find projects related to your own area. Some of them are region-based, some of them are thematic-based, and so forth. So I popped that into the chat. And then into terms of choosing where I've housed the oral histories, I mean, sometimes it's geographic, right? With the reason I'm housing it 2 different archives, which isn't always as common because archives oftentimes want their holdings to be unique, but both archives agreed that it made sense for the partnership because one has more resources, but the Archives du Québec has a bit more resources to do some of the digital preservation. The Archives Lesbian du Québec should also hold them because there are many lesbian stories. And so when we do the oral histories, we ask participants if they want it to be housed at their interview be housed at both archives or just one of them, and it's up to them to decide where they want their stories to go. But sometimes it's about who you've worked with or community partnerships and so forth.
This is great. Thank you for that link. That's amazing, Alex. And I echo that librarians are awesome. But I just wanted to add that if you have materials that you want to donate, the Lesbian History Archives is an open collection, and you can submit your materials to the Lesbian History Archives. That includes oral histories. It's not necessarily connecting it to a project as much as it would connect it to your personal materials and your name, and it would sit alongside the hundreds of other spoken word materials that we hold, which are what we would classify as oral histories. In addition, we still have the Lesbian Oral History Project, which was the digital project through the grant, and that there were 2 people focused on curating that, and now they're kind of a collective of people still coordinating. So if you were interested in contacting them, I'll put that contact page in the chat too.
So we have a number of questions that are a bit about the nitty-gritty of doing oral history projects. One person says, how does reporting on oral history act different from news articles or even an academic paper? Do you follow journalistic practices like fact-checking sources? That's one part of it. I'm going to give a bunch of different questions and you guys can respond to what you wish. Someone else asked if you use a script to do your oral histories, like are there a certain set of questions that you follow? And someone else asked, was it difficult to fundraise for these projects? So I throw out all kinds of questions for you to respond to any that you wish.
I think it really depends under what kind of context you're doing the oral histories. So I have to go through IRB or REB, like research ethics boards, for all the oral history projects that I do, because I'm affiliated with McGill University, and also because my funding comes from SSHRC, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And because of that, part of the Research Ethics Board requires that I create an initial script as well as documentation that I provide to the participants. But it doesn't mean that we can't like vary from the script. I do find that it is helpful to have an initial list of questions that I also then kind of make specific to each person that I might interview, because I like to send those questions in advance. One, because it allows people to start to think ahead of time. It can start to like spark ideas and memories, but also because I think it's just fair to the participants that they can kind of anticipate what's coming. I let them know that if they don't want to answer questions, that's totally fine. For the fundraising, it's all been kind of like linked to my position as a Canadian academic, so it's a little bit different. But if there's any Canadians in the chat, I can help kind of direct your resources there. Our funding space is a little bit different in Canada. And then in terms of fact checking, it's not quite like the journalistic practice of like, oh, no, you're wrong, or like on this, but instead, sometimes I'll bring something to the interview. So and I oftentimes will include some of that information in advance with the questions. So I'll say like, oh, in this newsletter, you were talking about something that was happening in 1993, or I can like share it on the screen or share it with the person. And so it's not as much like fact checking, because I don't know, I can't even remember what I ate for breakfast 2 days ago, let alone something happening 20 years. So it's not trying to be like a gotcha, which I think can happen journalistically, but more in terms of like, oh, I think it might have been in 1993. And then the person's like, oh, okay, so it can be kind of like guiding to help kind of spark memories. But my role isn't to correct the record. At least I don't see that as part of my role.
For the Pagoda book, which was, very focused on that particular cultural center and the history of it, I had a list of questions that I would give everybody to start with, particular to the pagoda, but I would also give them, well, I had a timeline that I put together from the research I did in the documents that were the newsletters and so on. So I had a lot of dates that I could call up. That people don't remember dates. They don't remember what happened in what order. So if I was going to interview somebody, for example, a musician who performed there, I could go through my timeline, I had it in a database, and tell them when they performed and what the dates were, and maybe even send them the flyer from that time, and that would help them to recall things about it. And that was different from the other more more general interviews that I did.
I often start with a list of questions, but I tend to change them for every one that I interview. Although some projects, so one thing I forgot to mention is that Marge put me in contact with Arden Eversmeyer from, oh, I just forgot the name of Arden's oral history project. Someone will remember this and put it in the chat, I'm sure. And then Arden connected me with someone who she was working with, and they shared their whole packet, and they had a list of questions I think that they asked every single woman that they interviewed. So you can really do it either way. And then I wanted to address the fundraising question that someone had. You know, a lot of the way that I've gotten small amounts of money are through grants with my connection with the university. But also, I started with a $0 budget, and that's what we had for a very long time. And you can do this work that way. Cell phones record pretty good sound these days. Especially they make these little mics that you can buy for like $60 that you can plug into your cell phone, like a little lavalier mic. But if you don't have that, you can also just use the phone. So I would say, and people have different opinions about this, but maybe worry about the money after you get started a little bit, like see where it goes and how things go for you, and then think about fundraising to expand it.
I know we don't have any time left, but I just wanted to lastly say that every oral history project will have different parameters. And what's great if you wanted to start your own is to create your own parameters and say, here's what I want to ask people, here's how I want to ask them, and here's what I want that to sound like. It can, I love the imperfection as was brought up earlier. So I think that, you know, don't get too bogged down into the logistics about it. There are like workshops and, you know, like weekends that you can take, and there's stuff on LinkedIn Learning that you can learn on how to conduct an oral history, or you can just like go ahead and do it. And if you find a place to deposit, then you can ask them what they recommend. But really, I agree that you can just get started.
Also, I popped it in the chat, the link, but I'm like the speaker series I run, we're having a free hybrid event on how to, like a workshop on how to do queer oral history, and it'll be recorded. So, and the recording will be on our website. So if folks are wanting to learn more.
Awesome. I have a lightning round before we do our dance number with 2 questions for you each to respond to, with just like short 2 or 3 word answers to each question. The first question is, do you have any dreams of collaborating with specific creatives in art, film, dance, etc., to bring another dimension to the oral history work? And then the second one is, what is a set of oral histories you would like to see other people preserve? Like, define your ideal oral history project parameter in like 5 words or less.
I guess
I want to.
oh, go. I guess we'll shout out Last Call New Orleans, because that's an amazing oral history project in New Orleans on Black and brown, trans, and queer folks. Then they make theater and podcasts and lots of stuff. So I wish I were as creative as the Last Call folks, and I'd just love to see more stuff from them or anything that's exciting y'all.
Great. Rose?
I second that. We had a story about them in one of our issues. I want to see somebody write about feminist choruses. You know, they're all over the place. They're mostly lesbian, even though some of them, you know, how do you count? But you know, there are some that call themselves lesbian choruses. But I want to see somebody write about those.
Thank you.
I'm interested in lesbian triads and polyamorous constellations as an oral history project. Somebody please call me when you're ready to do it. And then I'm interested in seeing oral history with theater, like having there be performance connected to the conversation. And I'm actually working on a project now to do the Rivers of Honey Theater Cabaret, which was a lesbian cabaret held in New York City for a few decades. But I love that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Kathleen, bring us home.
I want to see and hear more stories of rural butch dykes on tractors taking care of donkeys and goats and dogs.
Fantastic.
I have pictures for you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for this fantastic hour. We have more events coming up. Check out sinisterwisdom.org/events. I hope to see you in the near future. Max, put the song on. We all dance now to the L word. Information is in the chat, and I'll spotlight people. So put on your cameras and show us your best dance moves.
ever.
Thank you all so much. We'll see you next time.